Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery preparing to check in on a couple worm bins that were paired up despite the fact that there's 60 days difference in their ages. So if you look closely, they're right next to each other and you can see one of the bins started in April, May, June. The other one started in June, so basically 2 months difference. So those 60 days are a considerable difference in ages. And it shows when you get in there, and it also shows based on the way we've been treating the systems. The older system, we've been trying to get it eased into the point where we might be able to harvest its castings soon and move the worms off to a new home. The younger one we've been treating more as just an everyday system where we can put whatever we want in there. In fact, with the older one, we even sort of, I don't know, we kind of jumped right into foraging at some point, maybe a month and a half ago, and then we decided, you know what, let's keep going. But the way we've been going was to try to give the system fast composting foods, minimal or no bedding if possible. So these are the bins that I want to check in on today. So I'm going to get a glove on, get the systems up on the bench, and we're going to get to work. As I do from time to time, I've come with some info about these systems. The older system here is the one that's 255 days of age, fed 22 times, and the younger bin over here is 195 days of age, fed 16 times. And the older one is the one that, as I mentioned earlier, was the one that we started into the foraging process and then kind of called that off and got them going again. And it's been 10 days since we last fed them. So I think that covers most of the info we came down here with to share about them with you. So I could see that the feeding zone indicators, which in my bins is typically just a coffee filter, meant to show where we last fed, is still holding up quite nicely. But part of what I'm feeding them today includes a couple replacements, including the coffee that's in them, and a whole bunch of frozen veggies, once again very similar to what we did last time, consisting of materials which, for the sake of the older bin, are things that we believe are going to probably break down pretty quickly, so as to leave minimal, if possible, no residue or residual bedding bits. So I think when it comes time to feed, we'll just recycle these feeding zone indicators and put them to good use as being supplementary bedding down in the feedings. And I think basically we might even throw the feeding zone indicator that was over here in bin number 1, or the older bin basically, over into the younger bin so it can actually break down rather than just sitting around. It would be really nice eventually to see that the older system has done away with all of its residual bits and pieces of different stuff lingering in it, but there's stuff like this. Huge leaf stems, big ones. Ones that do seem like they're going to need quite a bit of time to break down. So even though we've already been feeding in such a way that we don't want to add bedding or even foods that are not going to break down too quickly, it does seem like there is plenty of stuff in here that's going to require some time to break down. So whatever. I think it's a good plan and I'm going to stick to it. In the younger bin, last time we threw in some of my prepared bedding. We didn't worry so much about the foods that we were putting in there, because I think there we've got a little ways to go. Although at this point, I believe that for both of these systems, kind of being up there in age, even the younger one, putting stuff like just straight leaves from my garden is probably a no-no, because otherwise those leaf stems are just going to stick around for a really long time. So I think getting rid of those is probably a good idea. This is this really weird, very tough material that I've bumped into so many times, and I've tried breaking it on a number of occasions, but I just have had no luck doing so. It almost feels like the shell of a nut or something. I mean, it's really tough. So at some point, I think we're probably going to end up screening this material, and that thing's going to come out almost for certain. There's no way that's going to break down anytime soon. A lot of times I would just exclude something like that. Maybe next time we bump into it, we'll do that, but I just threw it back in, and I'm not going to go fishing for it at this point. Well, let's make our way down towards the middle. right beneath where the feeding zone indicator was showing us where we last fed. These little guys got things like, I think they were cabbage leaves and perhaps some other stuff that was definitely expected to go down pretty quick. Or, go down, I mean, get broken down pretty quick by the worms. Consumed and turned into nice, beautiful worm castings. I believe we did add coffee and worm chow last time. So in addition to the coffee I showed you a moment ago, I've got a fresh batch of my worm chow on the ready as well. But I am kind of liking the idea of sort of just stirring the contents of these types of systems around, just so I can get a better idea of what all still remains in it. Here and there I've got chunks of corn cob, which I've been tending to want to leave whole instead of breaking them up to help them further, because that also seems to me like a type of object that would probably come out in a screening and come out easily as a whole object rather than needing to screen it out as a bunch of smaller objects. So those are the sort of exceptions to the methods that I'm using. Stuff like the big leaf stems, you saw me cracking those in half. I could certainly see those possibly also getting screened out, but in most cases I usually leave the leaf stems as my gauge to tell me that, yeah, the system is now free of any sort of large uncomposted materials and can be treated as just a batch of finished castings once I see very little or no leaf stems remaining in the material. So we've stirred stuff around. I believe the middle section where we usually feed and where, the vegetable matter that we give them brings with it a little bit of additional moisture. I think the middle of the bin where I feed is usually a little bit more damp than the rest of the material in the bin. So usually I don't pay too much attention to try to get that dampness spread out throughout the bin, but in an older system like this, it does seem like that little extra dampness combined with some of the stuff on the outskirts of the system that might not be quite as damp might be beneficial too, to help the worms feel really comfortable continuing to sort of cruise the entire contents of the container where there's a good degree of moisture for them everywhere, so they really nip off all the remaining little bits of leftover stuff. So let's move on to giving a good inspection of the younger system over here. And down here we did add prepared bedding. We did add some chunks of, I think, paper towel or napkin or something like that, so we were pretty routine with the application of bedding over here. And over here too, I'm not so much concerned with trying to homogenize the contents of the bin as I just did over there in the older system. Here I'm more inclined to just let it continue on at its normal pace, following my typical routine of just kind of adding the feeding and then maybe checking the outskirts just to make sure everything's holding up good, but then not worrying so much about trying to combine things all over the place for consistency's sake. Although, consistency throughout the worm bin is also probably a pretty good thing. But I'm not going to strive for that here. Here I'm going to kind of follow my typical feeding routine of just checking out how the leftovers are holding up, see how many there are, how the bedding that we put in last time is holding up. And there seems to be a good bit of it. Just this one stem of possibly cabbage or something is still in here, broccoli, I don't know what it was, but it was the stem of something, which is definitely making progress. But after only 10 days, it's not too surprising that there's some leftovers remaining. I do believe we were kind of selective when we went through the foods that we bought down for them. I sort of individually picked out things that we placed into the older bin that we were fairly confident would go pretty quick. And I think it's for that reason we saw very few leftovers over there of what we gave them last time. And then whatever remained was just dumped into here with a little less regard for trying to gear up the system for possible harvest in the near future, because it does seem like we're going to go a little while longer down here. So I've got my little collection of, not many, right, just a couple used napkins. And I even thought that perhaps today in here we would maybe even skip the addition of my prepared bedding. I didn't bring it out from the shelf. I just figured between these and then these old feeding zone indicators, not only the one that was in here, but also the one from the older bin being brought over here, could be a nice little foundation, albeit skimpy foundation for today's feeding as far as bedding goes. But as you saw, there's a good bit of leftover bedding from the last time. We were pretty generous in applying bedding last time, so I think today we're just going to skip. So let's get to feeding these little guys. Today I don't think we need to be terribly choosy, because I'm pretty sure everything in this assortment is stuff that's going to go pretty quick. So there's chunks of cucumber, there's pieces of Brussels sprouts. Here's the cucumber bits that I had in my hands earlier that I started with, and then there's also the leaves of radish. You know, when you buy some radishes or buy a bunch of radishes, the leaves are also usually included. And there's a few tomatoes in here from my collection of tomatoes that I bought in from my garden at the end of the season. So all these little cherry tomatoes are ones that were already getting to the point where they didn't seem fit for human consumption anymore and got thrown in the freezer to be transformed at some point soon into worm food. And there they go, turning into worm food as planned. And these are all things that I believe over here in the older bin, as well as the younger bin, pretty equivalent feedings, are all things that I think are going to go fairly quickly. So on top of our feeding can go the portion of coffee. Let's see if we can scoop out the last little bits of radish leaf that was left behind, get it back into the system where it belongs. And it's a better place than getting caught in the trap of my sink when I rinse off the container after I brought it back up to the kitchen. So down into the feeding zone can go this portion of coffee. We'll hang on to the filter to become its replacement feeding zone indicator. In with the coffee, what I like to do sometimes is add worm chow if I've got any. Past couple feedings that I didn't include worm chow since I ran out a day or two ago, but earlier today I came down and prepped a new jar of this stuff. So we're all set to go with a nice fresh batch of worm chow to aid us in feeding our systems. And I think that's pretty much it. So at this point we'll traditionally use the covering up of the feeding zones as a reason to sort of at least till up and aerate the outer edges of both of my systems. In the case of the older bin, we've already taken the extra time in the beginning to sort of stir up the entire contents, so over there it'll just be a matter of covering up the feeding here. This will be our quick chance at glimpsing into the outer edges of the system to see how things look. Like over here, for example, a pretty good size pile of worms came out when we excavated. Let's see what we see over on this edge. Sometimes the edge of the bin is where the worms want to be for whatever reason, rather than where we most recently added the foods. And other times they come out to the feeding area because they're hungry, and that's the place to be, especially if it's a food item that they really enjoy. So that looks pretty good. There's a big chunk of corn cob. Let's submerge that a little bit down into the feeding area, and then we can mark where we last fed. A lot of my systems also, on top of the feeding zone indicator, often include a just a top covering piece of paper, usually newspaper or something like that. I don't have that here, no particular reason. I don't always have a rhyme or reason to what I'm doing. But in the case of these systems, we don't have top coverings. All we seem to have here are feeding zone indicators, and I think that's fine. Perhaps at some point in the near future, especially for the sake of this older system here, maybe we'll come back in here and include some sort of a top covering, just because of the fact that there has been no fresh addition of bedding, perhaps at least giving them a little material out on the top surface that resembles what most worm bins get as bedding, just in case they're in the mood for some sort of food that's similar to that. Maybe we'll just do that for that purpose, but for now I'm not bothering. We skipped the prepped bedding, we skipped top coverings. Sometimes I just like to deviate from the norm. So I got a few things I got to take care of getting cleaned up and put away, but I'm not going to waste your time with that. That's boring. Before I go there really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.